dirt from the mud entering into the body and therefore into the bloodstream and causing infection. Fatal, it did cause a terrible amount of suffering. It caused catastrophic wounds to flesh, they tore through bone, really dreadful injuries.
Brilliant shards of crimson and gold pierced the eastern sky as dawn broke over Cambrai on November 20, 1917. On the dewy grass of a nearby hillside, Private Percy Blair of the 7th Battalion, East Surrey Regiment, was lying on his belly next to his commanding officer, awaiting the signal to advance. Shortly after the shelling began, his commanding officer gave the signal. Clare fixed his bayonet to his rifle and began marching down the exposed hillside with the other men in his platoon. Clare inched forward and negotiated tangles of barbed wire, keeping low to avoid the bullets flying overhead. Then, 700 yards from the enemy's trench, he felt a sharp blow to the side of his face. A single bullet had torn through both his cheeks. His face was too badly maimed to even arrange itself into a grimace of pain. Clare was now one of countless men whose shattered faces had come to symbolize the worst of a new, mechanized form of war. The evolution of war. From the moment the first fire rang out over the Western Front, one thing was clear: Europe's military technology had wildly surpassed its medical capabilities. Bullets tore through the air at terrifying speeds. Shells and mortar exploded with a force that flung men around the battlefield like rag dolls. Ammunition contained magnesium fuses ignited when lodged in flesh, and a new threat, in the form of hot chunks of shrapnel, often covered in bacteria-laden mud, wrought terrible injuries on its victims. Noses were blown off, jaws were shattered, tongues were torn out, and eyeballs were dislodged. In some cases, entire faces were obliterated. The nature of trench warfare led to high rates of facial injuries. Before the war was over, 280,000 men from France, Germany, and Britain alone had sustained some form of facial trauma. In addition to causing demise and dismemberment, the war was also an efficient machine for producing millions of walking wounded. Between 8 and 10 million soldiers lost their lives during the war, and over twice as many were wounded, often seriously. Many survived only to be sent back into battle. Others were sent home with lasting disabilities. Those who sustained facial injuries, like Clare, presented some of the greatest challenges to frontline medicine.
Caused catastrophic wounds to flesh, they tore through bone, really dreadful injuries. Dirt from the mud entering into the body and therefore into the bloodstream and causing infection led to a rise in things like syphilis and gonorrhea. Particular danger, machine gun bullets especially entered the body at a very, very high velocity.
The plight of the facially disfigured. Disfigurement and mutilation were ubiquitous on the battlefields of the First World War, in military hospitals, convalescent homes, towns, and villages. At the Specialist Hospital for Facial Injuries near Sidcup in Kent, over 11,000 operations were performed on some 5,000 servicemen between 1917 and 1925. Facial injuries were not easily treated on the front line. Surgeons would sometimes stitch together a jagged wound without taking into account the amount of flesh that had been lost. As the scars healed, the flesh tightened, pulling the face into a hideous grimace. Jaw injuries could leave men unable to eat or drink. Some men had to be nursed sitting up to stop them from suffocating when they lay down. Others were blinded or left with a gaping hole where their nose used to be. It's unsurprising that disfigured soldiers were viewed differently from their comrades who sustained other types of injuries. For centuries, a marked face was interpreted as an outward sign of moral or intellectual degeneracy. People often associated facial irregularities with punishment, wickedness, and sin.
So you have to unroll it really carefully because otherwise the emulsion can peel off.
To the brutal and shocking realities of day-to-day life and death in the trenches.
In fact, disfigurement carried with it such a stigma that French combatants who sustained these wounds during the Napoleonic Wars were sometimes simply slain by their comrades, who justified their actions by claiming that they were sparing these injured men from further misery. The misguided belief that disfigurement was a fate worse than demise was still alive and well during the First World War. Upon their return, disfigured soldiers often suffered self-imposed isolation from society. The abrupt transformation from typical to disfigured was not only a shock to the patient, but also to his friends and family. Fiancés broke off engagements, children fled at the sight of their fathers, One man recalled the time a doctor refused to look at him because of the severity of his wounds. These reactions by outsiders could be painful for veterans. Returning soldiers became victims of despondency, of melancholia, leading, in some cases, even to them taking their own lives.
Their stories are told in an imaginative and startling way.
Once you restore it, the thing that happens is that this film becomes about people, about human beings, about faces of these guys.
Enormous amount of detail in it. The only problem is it's so fragile.
Challenges for the medical community. Doctors and nurses at wartime hospitals experienced enormous challenges, but none was more daunting than the one posed by men with facial injuries. For these patients, survival alone wasn't enough. Further medical interventions were necessary if these men had any hope of returning to some semblance of their former lives. Whereas a prosthetic limb did not necessarily have to resemble the arm or leg it was replacing, a face was a different matter. Any surgeon willing to take on the monumental task of reconstructing a soldier's face not only had to address loss of function, such as the ability to eat, but also consider aesthetics in order to reflect what society deemed acceptable. Complicating matters, plastic surgery was not yet a formal discipline, and virtually no British surgeon had any clinical experience in this field. Efforts in earlier periods to rebuild, repair, or otherwise alter the appearance of a patient's face were typically confined to small specific areas, such as the nose or the ears. Still, the most basic operations remained rare, even as developments in anesthetics in the latter half of the 19th century made them less painful than in previous periods.
Sometimes men were retrieved simply by their own comrades, who might pick them up and carry them if that were possible.
Hugely significant factor for all of these injuries was the time that it took to retrieve casualties from the battlefield.
His description, his really evocative description of a soldier guttering, choking, drowning, fatal, it did cause a terrible amount of suffering, life and death. And it was this consideration that really did influence thoughts about how better to treat the wound, more long-term care, and ultimately for the very long-term wounded, that meant convalescence care back in Britain. It's
a historical perspective. Earliest mention of reconstructive surgery were the treatments for the plastic repair of a broken nose are first mentioned in the 1600 BC of an Egyptian medical text written on a piece of papyrus. The Romans also performed plastic cosmetic surgery using simple techniques, such as repairing damaged ears, from around the 1st century BC. Several ancient Sanskrit medical treatises mention some types of plastic surgery in India, such as the works of Sushruta and Charaka. These works were translated into the Arabic language during the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 AD. The Arabic translations made their way into Europe via intermediaries. In Italy, the Branca family of Sicily and Gaspare Tagliacozzi became familiar with the techniques of Sushruta. British physicians traveled to India to see rhinoplasties being performed by Indian methods. Reports on Indian rhinoplasty performed by a potter, Vaidya, were published in the Gentleman's Magazine by 1794. Joseph Constantine Carpeaux spent 20 years in India studying local plastic surgery methods. In 1814, Joseph Carpeaux successfully performed an operative procedure on a British military officer who had lost his nose to the toxic effects of mercury treatments. Father of plastic surgery, Harold Gillies. Harold Gillies was a forward-thinking surgeon of the 19th century, waiting in the wings, ready to offer innovative treatments to novel injuries to the face, giving thousands of soldiers like Private Percy Clare a second chance. A New Zealand otolaryngologist working in London, he developed many of the techniques of modern facial surgery in caring for soldiers with disfiguring facial injuries during the First World War. During World War I, he worked as a medical minder with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Due to his untiring efforts, the Army's chief surgeon, Arbuthnot Lane, was persuaded to establish a facial injury ward at the Cambridge Military Hospital, Aldershot, later upgraded to a new hospital for facial repairs at Sidcup in 1917. He was a pioneer, not only in plastic surgery, but in assembling a multidisciplinary team of surgeons, dentists, artists, anesthesiologists, sculptors, and photographers. This team was these soldiers' last best hope. It was called the Guinea Pig Club at Queen Victoria Hospital, Sussex. Among the better-known members of his club were Richard Hillary, Bill Foxley, and Jimmy Edwards. Unglamorous world of plastic surgery. Gillies sent his own casualty labels to the field hospitals in France to make sure that men with such injuries were sent directly to him. He identified the need to advance the specialty of maxillofacial surgery and use skin grafting technique to treat facial wounds. Some of these soldiers had to endure close to 40 or more incremental procedures to restore a semblance of their pre-war faces. Once in the operating room, Gillies and his team might have to excise thick scar tissue and maybe take skin flaps from a patient's cheek and chin to construct a new top lip. Sometimes an entire face would be drawn on a patient's chest and transplanted whole. As Gillies was perfecting his techniques through trial and error, inevitably procedures failed. Noses collapsed, skin grafts didn't take. When a soldier's wounds were too severe for surgery, the artists stepped in, surveying pre-war photographs to craft lifelike masks out of painted metal. Many of the procedures were not only necessary, but were grotesquely painful for the patients receiving treatment. Post-war development. Though Gillies deserves the lofty title of father of plastic surgery, his art was birthed and helped along into infancy with many contributions by his colleagues, particularly those healing from the Great War era. A few names like Erich Lexer, Johannes Esser, August Lindemann, and Christian Brunn were instrumental in the development of plastic surgery as a definitive branch of medical science. Though the Sidcup surgeons dispersed after the war and took their expertise throughout the world, they left an indelible mark on this branch of surgery. The Americans made the most of this. In Britain, there were only 2 plastic surgeons until 1929, when Gillies and Kilner were joined by Rainsford Molam and Archibald McIndoe. Much of their work was private, since the teaching hospitals were reluctant to introduce a new specialty. It was not until a military service had to be reinvented for the Second World War, and McIndoe's guinea pigs, mainly a bomber crew rather than dashing fighter pilots, became notorious that plastic surgery developed a respectability beyond cosmetic surgery. But the principles outlined by Gillies as the key to successful surgery remain just as true today, despite advances in knowledge of the microcirculation and immunology, surgical technique, and imaging, which have revolutionized management in a way that he could not have dreamed of, but would have embraced with enthusiasm. That's all we have for you, folks. Join us next time.